Good evening. I'm Noel Lateef, President of the Foreign Policy Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the annual Elbrun Kimmelman Distinguished Lecture on U.S. India Relations. As a valued member of the FPA board, Elbrun brings to FPA not only leadership qualities and wisdom, but a deep curiosity about the world. This evening, we are the lucky beneficiaries of her vision and special interest in India, its culture, its history, and its important place on the global stage. Please join me in welcoming Elbrun to introduce this timely lecture in the series that bears her name. Elbrun Kimmelman.
Thank you all for coming this evening, and I just have to apologize that I'm not a good enough writer to make this shorter and still make the points, but we're all very excited to have William Dalrymple here to speak on his new book, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. And it is very likely to transform your own ideas about India. William has written more than a dozen books, most of which are about India, its people, its history. The Golden Road is a book by a mature thinker, an expert historian, who has spent a lifetime, he's still a very young man, but it's all his life, he's been investigating and exploring the records, the geography, people, politics, art, even music of his subject. William has a nose for finding original sources and even collects books in languages he cannot read and has them translated as research. He has brought the intellectual world of his subjects and commentators together through co-founding the Jaipur Literary Festival. Now in its 18th year, it has hosted 500 authors and over 50,000 attendees each year, including yours truly. Though not founded for such a purpose, it keeps William in the center of his subject and those who care about India. He's a great storyteller and has attracted 55 million downloads from viewers of his Empire series of podcasts. William was born in Scotland with a silver spoon, probably a family heirloom, in his mouth. He has literary roots, including Virginia Woolf, in his blood. He and his artist wife, Olivia, live in New Delhi and Scotland, where their 3 children were raised and traveled extensively. Their son, Sam, has recently published his first book, Scattered Lands, 5 Partitions and Making of Modern Asia, to rave reviews and appearing on the same bestseller lists as William, his very proud father. Educated at Ampleforth and Trinity, William set out to follow the footsteps of Marco Polo's 13th century route from Jerusalem to Xanadu and the summer palace of the Kublai Khan. The resulting book, In Xanadu, A Quest, was a blend of travel, adventure, historical anecdotes, and encounters with locals. It won many awards, including a charming one called the Yorkshire Post's Best First Work. City of Djinns, followed by about the 7 ancient cities that make up modern-day Delhi. It covers events from the Mughal era to partition of India in 1947. Both books indicated the methods, direction, and scope that Dalrymple's work would take. He traveled around what had been the Christian Middle East, exploring the history and remains in order to understand how it had become the Islamic Middle East, while writing from the Holy Mountain. Understanding massive regional changes of religion fascinated the young Dalrymple and still does. William next turned his full focus to India, writing a series of books which look at Indian history from different views, new and therefore often revisionist views. White Mughals is about the early British period under the East India Company rule. It marked a transition into writing narrative history and revealed the importance of South India under the Muslim Nizams of Hyderabad. The story is about a love affair between the British and the Muslims who made up much of the ruling class at the time. Here we go. Sorry. The main character, whose romantic and political entanglements mirrored the problems of India, brought tears of sympathy in the telling, as the national partition also would. The best-selling book resulted in more awareness of Dalrymple's work in the United States. It was followed by The Last Mughal, The Fall of a Dynasty, Delhi, 1857, about the decline of the great Mughal achievement in India through internal decadence and external opportunism of the British government in taking over from the British East India Company. And least one missed the point. His book, Anarchy, The Restless Rise of the East India Company, detailed the rise and control and governance of India for 100 years by a corporation, and the ensuing justification by the British government to nationalize the most profitable private business. Foreign policy is all about understanding the underlying history behind issues in order to help create bridges for solving new and recurring opportunities. William Dalrymple rediscovered the interactive history of the Indosphere, and in so doing opens new approaches to foreign policy by tapping into historical relations. Marco Polo arrived in China in 1275 Common Era, heralding the overland Silk Route. While many think of the Silk Route as marking the beginning of Western trade with the East, more than 1,500 years before Marco Polo arrived in China, Indians navigated their boats and traded along the coastline of the Red Sea, peddling products that reached Egypt and maybe even Europe, the space we know today is Europe. They traded along the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal, reaching Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, the South China Sea, as well as Indonesia and other islands in the China Sea. What Dalrymple calls the Indosphere Golden Road was fully established at least 900 years before Marco Polo arrived. India's intellectual strengths and benefits from trade were officially recognized by the Empress Wu Zetian, who made Hindu Buddhism the official faith of China in 327 Common Era, and empowered a trail of monastic villages with empire protection, allowing them to flourish while peacefully spreading the values and aesthetics of the Indians, as well as the monotheism and Indian intellectualism, maths, script, grammar, and science. This is a very different, much bigger East-West story than that of Marco Polo, if you think about it. To further contextualize the importance in terms of today, India is anything but a cultural arrivist. It is culturally old and rich, while its population is young and eager, with over 71% of the H-1B visas going to Indians in 2024, mostly for technology jobs. In today's world, India ties with China for the largest population. exceeds it slightly, I think, but it's basically 1.4 billion. Followed by the EU, 550 million, U.S. 340 million, and Indonesia, 281 million. It is the largest democracy with 67% of its voting age public turning out. The majority have voted for Narendra Modi. It has the second largest Muslim population after Indonesia and surpassing that of Pakistan. 62% of Indians Muslims voted in the last national election, with 10% voting in support of the current leader, Narendra Modi, a Hindu nationalist. India is one of the 9 nuclear countries, having developed its nuclear capacity on its own. It has one of the largest standing armies, and its military is ranked as number 4th most powerful. Modi has sought to bring India's military equipment, particularly naval capacity, up to world class. He has also sought to strengthen defense ties with Muslim countries, including Saudi, UAE, Oman, Malaysia, and Egypt. India is a member of the Quad, along with the U.S., Australia, and Japan, which is one of the U.S.'s central platforms for strategy in the Asian Pacific and the Indo-Pacific regions. India is in conflict with many of her neighbors, particularly China, that seeks to control Indian water supplies from the river sources in Tibet in the Himalayas. China also continues to expand their military, trade, and fishing prominence in the southern seas by the strategic leasing and enlargement of a major port in Sri Lanka, and having increased its size and capacity 100-fold. Various reports project that India is on track to become the world's 4th largest economy, surpassing Germany and Japan sometime between 2028 and 2030. India could become the main engine of global growth as early as 2028, not because of its size, but rather because of its speed. It might even, some people think, surpass China's GDP by 2050, literally fueling disagreement with the United States regarding India's need to purchase gas and oil from Russia, a longtime India friend, in order to achieve her goals. Thinking of William Dalrymple's Indosphere and the Golden Road it once supported makes thinking about today's opportunities for India's success more plausible and much more complicated. William will speak his long speech and has agreed to respond to questions and comments at the end of his talk. There are books available for sale, and we invite you to join us for a reception with the author afterwards. Now, please join me in welcoming William Dalrymple.
Thank you all for coming out. And yeah, Elbrun is quite right. India will overtake Germany and Japan in the next few years to become the 3rd largest economy in the world very soon. And what I'm going to talk about today, which is ancient India, should be seen in that context. We all need to know a lot more about India, and we need to be more familiar with Indian history and India's past contribution to the world. Without understanding India's central role in the ancient world, you can't understand, in a sense, how this is not some great surprise, some flash from the blue, but is in fact a return to the center stage which India has occupied for much of history. Because India is one of those parts of the world which very early on came up with profound answers to the basic questions that humanity asked of itself. What are we doing here? what is this world we live in? What is the relationship of this world to the moon, the skies, the heavens, the sun? There were other countries, of course, early in man's history, which also came up with answers. And in the West, we're particularly familiar with the answers produced by ancient Greece. In the last few years, we've become also, I think, very familiar with the contribution of China. And there's been a great deal in exhibitions and documentaries and academic programs highlighting the Silk Road, this road which Elbrun mentioned, running from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, which is often perceived now in the West as the main artery of East-West contact. We're much less familiar with India's contribution. And that's a surprise in a sense, because Britain and India were so closely tied for 300 years. You'd expect much more familiarity in the West. But perhaps there is a relationship between that, the fact that India was colonized is part of the story of why we are less familiar with its contribution. After all, you can hardly claim to be bringing civilization to a country which has been incredibly civilized 3,000 years before you were getting out of your bearskins and painting your bodies with woad. And indeed, I think the attitudes that we have to Indian learning and Indian knowledge systems in antiquity are formed by attitudes such as Macaulay, in his famous Minute for Education, stating that a single shelf of a good English library is worth all the total literature of India and Arabia. We laugh at these ideas today, but they're still oddly present by default in our education systems. The fact that we do not learn anything about India's great contributions, particularly to mathematics. It's a very easy example. Everyone in this room, I suspect, particularly those of you who were brought up in any Western country, will by the age of 7 or 8 been familiar with Archimedes shouting Eureka in his bath. By the age of 10 or even 8, maybe learned about Pythagoras and his theorem. But virtually no one who was not brought up in South Asia has ever heard in the West of comparable figures such as Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. Aryabhatta, living in the 4th century in Pataliputra in Bihar, came up with the exact circumference of the Earth, the exact distance of the Earth to the moon and the sun, and realized 1,000 years before Galileo that we lived in a heliocentric universe, that the Earth revolves around the sun. But his name is almost unknown in the West. Even more remarkable is the complete absence in our curriculums to this day of Brahmagupta, a follower of Aryabhatta who lived a century later in Rajasthan or Mount Abu, and who, meditating around the concept of sunya, this idea of the void, which is so central in Buddhist and Hindu thought, came to define zero. Now, zero was not a completely new concept. It had existed in Babylonian thought and in various other Middle Eastern civilizations, but as a placeholder, as a absence. Brahmagupta realized that zero was a number with its own properties, and in his work he defines 40 rules connected with zero, of which, for example, one is that it is the number you get when you subtract a number from itself. And so once you realized that zero was a number, it's that you can. He also came up with the idea of place value, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, algebras, algorithms, and opened up the whole world of higher mathematics. Once you've got zero, you can do all sorts of fancy mathematical tricks, which otherwise remain closed to you. And it is Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta together that came up with the number system that we all use every day, arguably India's greatest contribution to the world. And yet in the West, we know these numbers as Arabic numbers. Not entirely wrong, because the West got them from the Arabs. And so an understandable mistake, but one that has not been corrected, and one of which most people are ignorant. And at the end of this talk, I'll talk about the extraordinary story of India's contribution to mathematics, astronomy, astrology, one science in India called Jyotisa in Sanskrit, which, as I say, is probably India's greatest contribution to mankind. Every day, the laptop in front of me here, every phone in this room has those numbers. They begin in North India in about 250 BCE and reach their final form in Islamic Spain as late as the 8th, 9th century. And it's out of Islamic Spain that they reach Europe. But there are other great contributions of India. And I'm going to talk in the next half hour about, in a sense, I suppose, three headings. One about mathematics at the end, but also about Buddhism, a religion that many people don't associate with India at all, because it's obviously largely today at its most glorious in Tibet and Sri Lanka and Burma and Laos and Southeast Asia. But the Buddha lived in modern India. He preached his first sermon in Sarnath outside Varanasi. He had his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya near Bihar. And it is profoundly entrenched in Indian thought. And its lineaments are in reaction to the Vedas and Jainism, as we will see. And then a little bit later, in the 5th century AD, you have the rise of Hinduism and the spread of Sanskrit. For 600 years, Sanskrit becomes the lingua franca all the way from Kandahar in Afghanistan through to Bali in Southeast Asia. And is the language of every educated court between those two places. And with that comes the rise of Hindu kingship and the whole world of the civilization of Hindu Southeast Asia, culminating in the largest and most spectacular Hindu temple in the world being built not in India, but in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. So those are the three headings which I'm going to talk about today. And we're going to start off with Buddhism. But before I leave this slide, we should perhaps say how I think the success of China's promotion of this idea of the Silk Road, an idea which New York, in fact, has a lot to do with the revival of this idea. It was an exhibition at the Met in the 1980s that really kicked off the rise of this concept, because the Silk Road, perhaps surprisingly, is not a word that has any great antiquity. Marco Polo does not talk about the Silk Road. No Chinese or Western source talks about the Silk Road. It's in fact the invention of a German geographer in the 1870s, Baron von Richthofen, who comes up. Richthofen was the grandfather of the First World War flying ace, the Red Baron, that some of you may have come across in your childhood reading. And he designed it originally as a railway line running from Berlin to what was then Peking. The word enters the English language in 1936 with the publication of the travel memoirs of Sven Hedin, a Nazi-sympathizing Swedish explorer. But it's only in the 1980s with this Met show that the idea really takes off. And yet now it's become so much to dominate our understanding of East-West commerce in ideas and in trade that it is a shorthand now for East-West exchange. And yet it is a specifically, obviously, Sinocentric idea, which, as this map illustrates, completely ignores India. If you look at this map, there are this wonderful road running east-west across the thin waste of Asia from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, through such resonant names as Samarkand, Merv, Tashkent, Turfan, Dunhuang. But this map completely ignores India. In fact, in this particular map, taken at random from one of the 40 books on the Silk Road published this decade, India is an absence. It has only the Himalayas to distinguish it. And even the maritime route just sort of goes around the Indian coast, not bothering to stop off. Now, it is my contention in this book that is a profound misunderstanding of East-West trade. Because in the classical period, centuries before Marco Polo, Roman authors make it very clear that it is India that is, in the words of Pliny, the drain of all the precious metals in the world. Romans spent so much on expensive luxuries coming out of India, that they complain about the drain of gold and silver into Indian pockets. And the response is a rather familiar Trumpian one. 30% tariffs are put up in the Red Sea on all Indian imports. And we shouldn't tell Trump, but this actually provides major funds for the Roman Empire. And economic historians are now talking maybe as much as a quarter of the Roman imperial budget coming from these tariffs. Making a profound difference to the building of Hadrian's Wall, the Appian Way, the road networks, the Saharan forts in North Africa, and so on. Because we know from classical sources, if you look at Strabo, geographer living in Alexandria, he takes the new Roman governor of Egypt on a trip around his new governorate. And in the Red Sea, at the port of Myos Hormuz, comes across a fleet of 250 vessels waiting to sail to India. And yet, while classical sources are so full, once you begin to look for it, for references to the enormous trading fleets that annually leave the Red Sea, and as this map shows, it's a very short journey that you can make in 6 weeks with the monsoon winds behind you, from the Red Sea ports of Roman Egypt to Kerala or Gujarat or Sindh, that fleets of 250 vessels are leaving annually. And yet we do not know a single case. We cannot name a single Roman who ever talks accurately and substantially about China or claims to have visited it, or in reverse, any Chinese scholar or trader who talks about Rome. There is, towards the end of the Roman period, a book which mentions Thina and Ceres as a place far away and difficult to get to, in contrast to the 30 or 40 Indian ports that it gives substantial details to. Likewise, in Chinese sources, they talk about, in late Han sources, about Da Qin, which may or may not be Rome. But there is not a single case of a substantiated journey from one to the other in either direction. And yet this Silk Road has come to dominate our understanding, and we have completely forgotten the substantial, verified contact between the two. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this is to look at the archaeology, particularly to track the most obvious record of trade, which is coins. And last year, helpfully, just as this book was coming out, Oxford University plotted Roman coin hoards. Now, if this Silk Road was to be all that it's made out to be, you'd expect a line of Roman coin hoards to be crossing east to west. This is actually what happens. Most Roman coins, obviously, are in the Roman Empire, in France, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, around the rim of the Mediterranean, around the Black Sea. There is a little tail leading down the Nile, and a few dotted finds in in Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. There has not a single Roman coin hoard ever found in China. The first Roman coins are of the early Byzantine period, from the period of Justinian in the 6th century. But look at India. Look at the bottom right-hand corner of this map. Bright orange with Roman coin hoards, exactly as Strabo and Pliny would lead you to explain. And here, very simply, is an example, I would argue, of historical groupthink, that this notion that East-West trade was dominated by China, that by silk, is simply incorrect in the classical period. India, not China, was the principal trading partner of the Roman Empire, and the route was not overland, but the maritime routes using the monsoon winds. And fleets of, as Strabo says, 250 vessels traveled in just 6 weeks between the Red Sea and Kerala and Sindh and back again. So we need to completely rejig our ideas. I'm not for a minute arguing that the Silk Road never existed, or that capillary trade, that a single object could pass from hand to hand in a matter of decades, pass across the whole route. But for most of history, Persia lay between the West and the East, and was always at war with first Rome, then Byzantium. And the first time that you actually get direct trade between the two is when the Mongol Khans, Genghis Khan, smashes through Persia and does create communications that link the Mediterranean and the South China Sea. So in 1271, Marco Polo does pass from Jerusalem to Shangtu in Xanadu in Mongolia in a matter of weeks or months using a Mongol passport. But that is not possible in Roman times, and we have no record of such a journey. So I would argue in this book that we have substantially over-egged the Silk Road and over-egged the importance of China and over-egged the importance of silk and substantially underestimated the central role of India in early trade between East and West. Now, the first of the headings I want to talk under is Buddhism. And the first thing to be said is that the Buddha was a historical character. He lived in the mid-5th century in the Gangetic Plains. He was born just over the border from India and Nepal in Lumbini, preached his first sermon in Bodh Gaya in Bihar, and preached his first sermon in Sarnath outside Varanasi and had his enlightenment at Bodh Gaya. Oddly, though, there are very few records of Buddhism outside the immediate area that the Buddha lived for about 200 or 300 years. The big transformation takes place with the rise of the Emperor Ashoka, 250 BCE. Ashoka is appalled by the bloodshed he's caused in one of his wards with the Kalinga who live in Orissa, converts to Buddhism, and not only converts to Buddhism, but encourages everyone around him to adopt his faith, both within his empire and outside. He sends what he calls Dharma ministers to Sri Lanka, into what's now Burma, and particularly into the Hellenistic world of Seleucus and Antiochus and Ptolemy, the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander. According to one inscription in Kandahar, he sent missionaries as far as Cyrene, which is modern Libya. And we see the results on the ground. Buddhism, which does not show any record of having left the Gangetic Plain in the early centuries, suddenly we find gorgeous wall paintings in the Deccan, extraordinary monasteries like Bajar outside Pune cut out of the living rock. Particularly in Sri Lanka, we see the results of the conversion of the king of Anuradhapura by Ashoka's son Mahinda in a whole series of stupas and extraordinary early Buddhist remains. Mahinda, the son of Ashoka, is buried in Rajagala at the center of Sri Lanka. His stupa, this sort of prototypical stupa, very crude, just a ring of stones, was recently rediscovered by archaeologists. And this is the important map that I want you to focus on. This is a map that should be in every history curriculum because it's one of the great transformations of history. Out of that red zone, the Gangetic Plain, where Buddhism had existed for centuries, come now missionary journeys, not just southeast down to Sri Lanka, but northwest to what's now Pakistan and Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, into Gandhara, through Lhasa and Tibet to Dunhuang, Mongolia and Siberia, through Chang'an to Korea and Japan, through Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia to the Philippines. And this happens without bloodshed or military propulsion. Unlike Christianity, which, the conquistadors bringing the Bible to Mexico and South America, unlike the spread of Islam, Buddhism spreads by trade and by missionaries, and no conquest, no armies propel it on its journey. And yet it is a transformative moment. Through the soft power of Buddhism, Indian languages and concepts and philosophical ideas spread in 200 or 300 years permanently across Asia, leading to a complete and substantial transformation of the whole of Asia. Today, when you go to Japan or Burma or Thailand, Buddhist monks are in the streets, stupas are on every hilltop. And the attitudes engendered by Buddhism have profoundly transformed the whole of Asia ever since. And yet the origins of this in India are usually forgotten because there are so few Buddhists in India today. A few in Ladakh, a few Dalit Buddhists in Bangalore. And most Westerners do not particularly associate Buddhism with India at all. It's something that is associated in the movies with Tibet or, sort of levitating lamas like Marvel superheroes with vajras sparking out, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is it spreads with Indian traders. And in contrast to the Hollywood stereotype, early Buddhist monasteries are very ingrained in the trading and capitalist system. Early Buddhist monasteries lend money. They have slaves working their fields. They have women producing textiles, nuns. And it is the trading nature of early Buddhism that creates a network of monasteries along the trade routes. They continue to lend money. They act as caravanserais for early traders. And we have records in early Buddhist monasteries in India of traders repaying loans to monks and then giving their fortunes for karmic greenwashing, if you like, and the building of yet more monastic buildings. So early Buddhist monasteries are along the trade route and support the trade routes, and they're tied up with the trade routes. And by the 1st century, we get these extraordinary map here based on a book called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which sounds like everybody's worst sort of Latin translation from prep school, but actually think of it only as the kind of rough guide or the Lonely Planet of its day, written by a Roman sailor in the 1st century. It details how you trade with India and has intimate and detailed data on every Indian port on the west coast and several on the east coast. It details how you can stop in Ethiopia at the kingdom of Adulis and Aksum. It details the different things that you can buy or sell in different ports. The king of Barigaza in Gujarat, for example, has a taste for Roman castrati singing boys, so stock them in your hold if you want to make a fortune. And this map also usefully shows, in a sense, what propels all this. At the top of the map, you have that white space, which is Tibet. Look at the scale of it, the size of it. Every winter, it freezes over. Every spring, it thaws, which creates the unique gift of India, India's meteorology, because India uniquely has winds which blow outwards for 6 months of the year and then inwards for the next 6 months, which means that if you're an Indian sailor, you've only got to put up a sail. And once you've learnt to surf those winds, like a surfer in Hawaii, learning to use the waves to do what you want rather than drown you, you can pass, as I say, from Maziris in Kerala to Berenike on the Red Sea coast of Roman Egypt in just 6 weeks. You then can go to Alexandria, sell your goods, see the pyramids, go to a show. But you have to be back on the Red Sea by June to then catch the reversed winds, which in 6 weeks can take you home. So in a single year, you can do the whole trip there and back. And hundreds of sailors did. And the excavations at Berenike, which are going on at the University of Chicago, have produced extraordinary results, including this extraordinary head, which turned up just as I was finishing the book. The first Buddha head discovered in Egypt, in a temple to the goddess Isis. It's the most multicultural ancient object you can imagine. It is in the style of a Gandharan Buddha from Pakistan or Afghanistan, but not in the black schist, which we're used to. It's in white Proconnesian marble from the Marmara Sea outside Istanbul. So it's, if you like, a Pakistani-style Buddha in a Turkish marble, but as the archaeologists have shown from the way that what they nicely call the tortellini curls of the Buddha are drilled, it's done in a workshop in Alexandria in Egypt to commemorate an Indian sea captain arriving on the Red Sea coast. So we are now in a whole world of multinationalism and globalization in the early 1st century, which we didn't even know existed. And this is the reverse of something we did know about, which is the arrival of Christianity in Kerala. So while Christians are going to Kerala and Jews are arriving in Kerala, Buddhists are arriving in Egypt, which raises the question, 1st century Egypt, just 50 miles from Berenike, you get the first Christian monastery. Now, Buddhist monasteries had existed in India and Central Asia by now for about 400 years. Is Christian monasticism emulating, copying, inspired by Indian Buddhism? We can ask the question now, at least. We haven't got an answer yet. But excavations may have more substantial. This is, as I say, 50 miles from the monastery of St. Anthony in Egypt, which is the earliest Christian monastery. And this document has turned up, the Maziris Papyrus, now in Vienna, which gives economic historians the kind of data that they love. It's actually just a shipping invoice. It's a random survival, one container sent by a producer in Alexandria to a purchaser in Greek Alexandria. And what is he selling in these things? Well, we actually have a picture in a mosaic of Sicily of the products of India. So at the center, we've got this nice busty Indian yakshi, which actually is modeled, I think, on an Indian model. This is a yakshi from Kushan, Mathura. Now, you're not meant to be looking at the middle of this picture. You're meant to be looking at the top where her hand is touching the branch and it blossoms. And she's so fertile, she's so sexy and fecund that the tree bursts into flower as she touches it. Now, the Roman artist who did this was looking at the middle and is missing the point. He hasn't put a blossom on the tree. So it's entirely pointless. He's missed the entire point of the picture. But what it does show is the products of India. In her hand is ivory. Behind her are strings of pepper. Around her knees are silk. And silk is, according to the Periplus, bought not from China because they don't know about China. There's no reference to China. It's bought in Egypt. So if China and Rome ever did meet, it probably met on the quays of Gujarat or Kerala. And look at the silk. It's see-through. Now, that's not accidental because Pliny complains about this. He doesn't like... Pliny is a sort of, make Rome great again. He's MAGA for first century Rome. And he's a conservative naval commander who would certainly have voted for Trump if he had the chance. And he regards pepper, which she's got behind her, as a sort of woke spice, which only kind of the metropolitan elite would wear, in his view. Would use on their food. Why would you need this black stuff to put all over your food, he says. But he's even more skeptical about silk, which he thinks is a disgusting sort of Victoria's Secret porno wear. And he complains about metropolitan women in Rome turning up naked at parties with just this see-through textile. And he talks about one of Nero's mistresses, Lolina Paulina, who used to turn up at parties just in a single layer of silk so everyone could see everything. And wearing Indian pearls on her head, an Indian garnet in her belly button, and Indian diamonds on her shoes, I think. Anyway, the whole thing is very Indian confection. And she brought, this is the thing he really hates, she brought the receipts to parties to show off the price of it, which is a nicely sort of Punjabi touch for those who know India. And so he regards India as the source of all the unnecessary luxuries that the metropolitan elite, in his view, were wasting the gold of Rome on. You don't need any of this stuff, he's saying. What's wrong with olive oil and wool? You can just have it, nice Tuscan stuff that his grandmother wore. And you certainly don't want pepper on your food. The other thing that he probably did approve of is left and right elephants and tigers for the Colosseum. I think Pliny would have approved of the Colosseum, but... So this is what was being traded. And going back to the Maziris Papyrus, the figures that this gives show that Indian traders were basically ripping off the Romans very substantially. They were paying a fortune for this stuff. And it has three columns. The products themselves, the ivory, the pepper, the silks, the high prices being paid for it, and then the 30% Trump tariffs, which, as I say, the economic historians are now saying could have produced about 30% of the Roman imperial budget. So we have now data which shows the scale and the sheer riches produced by this trade. And the result is, if you look in the archaeology, lots of finds of Indian products in the archaeology of Italy and the Mediterranean. This is an Indian yakshi found in Pompeii, but also the reverse. These are lovely Alexandrian beakers. We have Russell Crowe on the left in his gladiator outfit, the Pharos Lighthouse in the middle, and the grape harvest on the right. Fancy Alexandrian glassware found where? Under the former American Air Force base in Bagram next to Kabul, which Trump says he wants back, and which the Taliban say they're not going to give him. Anyway, this is where this turns up. So luxuries are going in two directions. And the fact that I'm mainly talking about the influence of India in this lecture, but of course there's the influence of Rome on India in reverse. And so what you find is that while early Indian art doesn't depict the Buddha, he's shown as on the right as the wheel of law, on the left as a stupa or the flaming pillar. Suddenly, bingo, around the time this trade really gets going in the 1st century, but at the time that Anti-Cleopatra commits suicide and Octavius Augustus seizes Egypt, you suddenly find the beginning of these incredibly gorgeous Gandharan sculptures, which you can see beautifully displayed in the Met. And just look at the face of the guy on the right. He looks like a Roman senator. This is a very familiar art. And this is particularly clear when you look at, on the left, Augustus from the Forum, and in the middle, a Gandharan Bodhisattva from Peshawar. Look at the drapery. Very similar. Very similar indeed. So there's lots of influence heading in both directions, as will always happen in trade. And it is this mixed Indian-Roman fusion, if you like, which heads into China through Bamyan. And by the 2nd and 3rd century, Buddhism has reached from India into Western China, to Gansu initially in the west. But by the 4th or 5th century, you're getting Gupta-style sculptures, such as the one south of Delhi in Mathura on the left, influencing Chinese-style sculpture on the right. That's in the Met now, but was originally from Gansu. And you get these wonderful, very Indian deities in Chinese Buddhist temples. And by the 5th century, Indian Buddhist ideas are threatening the Confucians and the Taoists, who are writing very anti-Buddhist tracts at court. Now, the guy that makes the great breakthrough is this guy on the right, Xuanzang, the Buddhist pilgrim, a nerdy Chinese scholar who wants to read the uncorrupted original Buddhist texts. And he's worried that the Buddhist monastic texts that he's using in China are badly translated and corrupted. So he goes back to the source. Where does he go? The main center of Buddhist learning at the University of Nalanda. Now, Nalanda is not a name that many people know in the West, but it is the Indian equivalent of the Library of Alexandria. We're all familiar with the Library of Alexandria. We should be familiar with the Library of Nalanda. 9-story tall library, thousands of monks, but also just look at the floor plan. There are 9 successive courtyards like this. Now, what does this remind you of? A courtyard with scholars' rooms on either side, or all 4 sides, over 2 stories. It's the plan we have at Oxbridge or Harvard. That is the normal plan of a university. And you can argue, as some scholars do, that this plan starts in India, travels through the madrasas of Islam, and arrives in Islamic Spain. And where do the first universities in the West begin? Next to Islamic Spain. Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and then a century later, Oxford and Cambridge, bringing this exact floor plan all the way from India to the West. Now, whether or not you accept that, we have detailed information about the Nalanda that Xuanzang goes to. He talks about 10,000 monks studying the Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, astronomy, literature, and magic. It was 9 stories high, and the library contained 3 divisions: the Ratnadadi, the Sea of Jewels; the Ratnisagara, the Ocean of Jewels; the Ratnaranjaka, the Jewel Adorned. The priests, to the number of several thousand, from morning until night, engage in discussions. Lectures are given in 100 different lecture halls, and the students study diligently without wasting a moment. And we even have this tablet on the left, which is the donation tablet, establishing an expatriate college for Southeast Asian monks in Nalanda, established by the king of Srivijaya, which is modern Indonesia. And we know of other monks coming to study there from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, and even Korea. So India is not some peripheral place on the edge of a Silk Road map without any cities in it. This is the place that monks from all over Asia come. It is the Harvard, the Oxbridge, the NASA of its day, the center of the Buddhist world with the largest library. Now, when Xuanzang goes back to China, he finds that the court is now suddenly agog at this beautiful young concubine who has lodged with the new emperor Taizong, the first emperor of the Tang dynasty on the left. Now, Wu Zetian doesn't look like much in the print in the middle, I have to grant you, but she is clearly a bit of a hottie because she moves from Taizong somehow into the bed of Gaizong, his son, and you can see a bit closer, well, a bit more clearly what's going on in the Chinese soap opera on this subject, where she is this sort of vamp. And she moves from being concubine to partner, to empress, and then the emperor has a stroke and she takes over top left as the sole ruler. She's the only woman ruler to be a emperor in her own right in the whole of Chinese dynastic history. And the crucial point for our story is she converts China to Buddhism. The court, for one generation, for the 50 years of her rule, becomes a Buddhist court. She imports an Indian religion, and she does this how? She has her own Project 2025. They're called the Scholars of the Northern Gate, and it's her think tank. It's exactly what we today would call a think tank. And the Scholars of the Northern Gate, many of them are Nalanda alumni, some of them ethnic Indian, some of them Chinese, and they come up with a bunch of bogus prophecies, saying that she is the reincarnation of Maitreya. I mean, they're real prophecies, but they're kind of manipulated to apply to her. And she rules China using an Indian religion. The Confucians and the Taoists are temporarily exiled from court, and she is therefore later reviled by future Confucian historians, and her grave is just a black stele without an inscription. She's sort of written out of history. But as far as India is concerned, this is the high watermark of Indian influence in China. It doesn't last long, and the counterflow, if you like, the back current begins when she dies. But it is the high point, 660s, when you have a whole bunch of ethnic Indians with names like Gautama Siddhartha running, for example, the Bureau of Astronomy in Chang'an. So it's an extraordinary moment. But the crucial thing is it's not the only moment like this, because in Southeast Asia at the same time, Hinduism and Sanskrit are taking root at exactly the same moment. The 660s are, if you like, the moment of maximum Indian influence in the world. This is the moment when you have Sanskrit being spoken, Buddhism being at its peak. Now, how does Hinduism come to spread to Southeast Asia? Because famously, Brahmins are not meant to travel across the Black Water, according to at least modern Hindu, or certainly 18th and 19th century Hindu thought. So what happens is that, remember all that trade I was talking about a few minutes ago between Rome and India? That, of course, collapses when Rome falls in the 5th century. 410, Alaric, the Ostrogoths, the Goths, the Huns, the Vandals, all these guys come rampaging across the Roman world. Berenike and Myos Hormuz, the two great ports in the Red Sea, are abandoned. Overnight, the gold from Rome stops coming to India. But luckily for India, there is an institution ready to take up the slack. And this is a trading guild called the 500, based in Tamil Nadu and in Karnataka. And the 500 are like, those of you that remember the Game of Thrones, they're the Iron Bank of this story. And they are quite kick-ass. They have a corps of assassins. They have their own army. And what basically happens is they pivot eastwards. No more gold coming from the west. They look for it where? In what they call Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold, which are Palembang in Sumatra, Kutai in Borneo, Keling in Java, and later Okeo on the Mekong Delta and Champa in Vietnam. These are the new sources of gold which replace the gold coming from Rome. And Indian merchants fan out in boats like this, no longer sailing west to Rome, but east to Southeast Asia, to Savarnabhumi. And from the 5th century onwards, suddenly we start finding Buddhist and Hindu remains all over Southeast Asia, not before. There are records of earlier Indian traders going back thousands of years, but the first time we see Buddhism in the form of this nice bronze monk, or this lingam, or this yoni, or this image of Shiva, only in the 5th, 6th century that this begins. And we see it all over the Mekong Delta, which becomes a similar role to the Venetian lagoon in the western end of the trade routes. And there above the Mekong Delta, we find the first Hindu temples, Ashram Maharose, inside it, these extraordinary early Khmer sculptures. Now, the Khmer sculptures do not necessarily follow the same principles as the Hindu sculptures of India. This, for example, is an image of Jayavarman II. Top right, he's holding a discus and a conch, which are the attributes of Vishnu. He's saying, I am a god king, which is blasphemy in India, but it's what happens in Southeast Asia. And this is what's going on. A local ruler, let's call him Kudunga, in the second, with his moustache, is sitting under a baldachin, and a bunch of sadhus who look like they've just come out of the Kumbh Mela with their Brahmins' cords down the middle, are pouring pots of water over him in what is called the Abhisheka ceremony, which is the Hindu equivalent of a coronation. And Kudunga suddenly becomes Mahendravarman, or Suryavarman. He becomes this Sanskritic king, and we find the Brahmins bringing with them the South Indian script of Kanchipuram, which is the basis, called Pallava Granta, or Southern Brahmi, which is the basis not just of modern Tamil and modern Malayalam, the language of Kerala, but also the basis of every Southeast Asian language, Mon, Pew, Khmer, every pre-Islamic language script in Southeast Asia is based on this. And we suddenly find Hindu Sanskrit names in the landscape. A new Ayodhya, the capital of Lord Ram, is founded outside Bangkok. A new Kurukshetra, the battle of the Mahabharata, is founded in Laos. And most dramatic of all, a new Ganges flows through the middle of Southeast Asia. At its source, yonis and lingams are sculpted into the bed to sacralize it. And it is called Ma Ganga, or as it is pronounced in Khmer, Mekong. The Mekong is Ma Ganga. So you have this Hinduization and Buddhization of Southeast Asia. The traders adopt Buddhism, the rulers like Hinduism, because Buddhism is non-violent. And what is the point of being a king if you can't have a good battle or two? So the rulers prefer Hinduism, which celebrates, despite Mahatma Gandhi's love of non-violence, Hinduism, the great scriptures of Hinduism, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, are all about war. The Battle of Lanka, the Battle of Kurukshetra. And very rapidly now we see Hindu temples in the landscape. On the left, we've got the Shore Temple south of Chennai. We see an exact copy 5 years later in Java, Gedong Songo. Prambanan in the 9th century, larger than any 9th century temple in India, because India, an important point, is never a single nation state at this point. It is a accepted geographical and cultural unit, Bharat, from the time of the Mahabharata, but never is Bharat one kingdom. It is a mandala of rival kingdoms, according to Xuanzang, 70 when he goes to there. 70 rival kingdoms. And so no king has massive resources in the way that by the 9th century, 2 kings in Southeast Asia do. The king of Srivijaya controls all the islands of Indonesia and is a king of the ocean, while the Khmer Empire, don't tell Mr. Modi, is the most powerful Hindu empire ever and occupies the entire landmass of modern Southeast Asia. This enables Southeast Asian rulers to build Indian-style temples on a scale that no Indian ruler can afford. So Prambanan is the first sign of this happening. It's bigger than anything of the period in India. Borobudur, the greatest of all Buddhist ruins in Java, is built in Java on this wonderful mandala cell. And then finally, Angkor Wat in the 12th century, the largest Hindu temple ever built. The largest medieval building of any sort ever built. 1.1 million people live in Greater Angkor. At a time, London has about 20,000 people. The outer moat at Angkor encloses an area 4 times the size of the Vatican City. It's the greatest Hindu empire of its time. But already it's looking less and less specifically Indian. When Tagore goes to Angkor, he says, "Everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her." And what he means by that is that everything in Angkor has its roots in Indian imagery and Indian architecture, but it's developed on its own trajectory now. It's something new. It's something different. So anyway, we'll leave Hinduism there at the peak of Angkor and go on to mathematics. Now look, this is an inscription, Gwalior, carved in the 9th century, and you can all read it. It's 270. Those are our numbers. Okay, so how do we get there? So we're now going back 600 years. We've left 12th century Cambodia. We're now going to central India in 600 AD. We're in Udaygiri, which is the Greenwich astronomy of ancient India, along with Ujjain. This great statue showing Varaha, the boar incarnation of Vishnu, trampling a servant, and then next to him you can just see that sort of gym body. That's Chandragupta, the second, fresh from a workout with his pecs sort of glistening. And he is the guy under whom Indian astronomy reaches its peak. Aryabhatta, Brahmagupta, those mathematicians and astronomers I mentioned are very much being studied here. Their work is being used. Indian astronomers are plotting the heavens, predicting the future using the stars. And out of this comes the first zero. This is it, second row, that little dot in the middle is the first zero that's dated firmly. A century later in Gwalior, bottom right, 270, that is the first zero of our form, the circle in existence that's dated. And this is how we get our numbers. Now, we should all know this, but we don't. This should be a map in every child's textbook in every country of the world, but almost nowhere is this taught. Our numbers, the ones we all use every single day, begin with Brahmi, the Emperor Ashoka's script, in northern India, 1st century CE. The Gwalior inscription I just showed you is the second one down. Already you can see 3, you can recognize 7 and 0. And then it splits in 3. Indian numbers continue with the Sanskrit Devanagari form on the right. Slightly variant form develops in the Arab world, which we're going to talk about next, in the center. But it's the ones on the left that are most important for us, because the numbers developed in Morocco and Algeria and then Islamic Spain are our numbers. From the early form at the left through to the 15th century form, through to the very familiar numbers of Dura in the 16th century, at which point they fix and remain the numbers we use to this day. That's where we get them. Why are we not taught this? How is, in the 21st century, does no one in the world know these numbers? And everyone in the West calls them Arabic. Not wrong, because we get them from the Arabs, but they're not where they start. This is India's greatest contribution to world civilization, and everyone uses it. It's the nearest thing humanity has to a universal language, these number forms. Yet we've forgotten where they come from. So how do they get to the Arab world? Well, probably through a Disney character. I'm not making this up. Jafar in Aladdin is a historical character with his parrot. He didn't have a parrot in history, but he existed. And he is the character who is the friend of Harun al-Rashid in the Arabian Nights. He is the vizier of Baghdad. Now, his grandfather founds Baghdad. How and why? So these guys start off with something familiar in American corporate life, the Indian accountant. And he is the Indian accountant who funds the Abbasid revolution against the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th century. How is he such a good accountant? The answer is the family were previously Buddhists. They were Sanskrit literate. They used the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, and Granddad went to school in Srinagar in Kashmir, where he studied higher mathematics. They convert to Islam. They rise through the ranks for their ability to be able to do advanced, complicated mathematics. They're made viziers of Baghdad, and the first thing they do when they get to power in Baghdad is they send an embassy to Sindh, where they get the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta. And these are translated by, it takes a couple of generations actually to get a decent translation, because it's really complicated, terse, difficult Sanskrit verse. It's poetry, Aryabhatta writes in. Al-Fazari writes the first translation, doesn't really get it. But 2 generations later, Al-Khwarizmi turns up and produces the snappily titled, Compendious Book of Calculation by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. It's even more of a mouthful in Arabic. So everyone just knows it by a nickname, Algebra. While his name, Al-Khwarizmi, gives us the word algorithm. So it's in the meeting of Islamic and Indian thought that we get these 2 vital concepts, algebra and the algorithm. They're Indian inventions translated into Arabic, to which I should say Al-Khwarizmi does a lot more than just translate. He adds a bit of Euclid. It's a great book of genius. So look at this map. On the right, we've got Sindh, where the books of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta come from. They're brought to Baghdad, which is in irritatingly small letters beneath the word Iraq in capitals at the center of the map. Al-Khwarizmi comes from, look, top right, the Aral Sea. You can just see the word Khwarazm. That's Al-Khwarizmi, just means the guy from Khwarazm, which is modern Khiva in Uzbekistan. He comes to Baghdad, translates the Algebra, and the translation goes viral in the medieval Islamic world and becomes the basic text used to educate any young man in maths. Passes through Palestine, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and Spain. And by 950, the first Christian monks are using these numbers in Barcelona. But despite that, for another 150 years, Christians continue to ignore this largely and to continue using the Latin numbers, X, V, C, M, M, V, X, V, X, 1, 1. Now try giving your neighbor tonight your phone number in Latin numerals. It'll take you about half an hour. Try doing long multiplication with Latin numerals. It's even more of a sweat. And so Europe is held badly back by the fact that it's got this very clumsy number system compared to the Islamic or Indian worlds. And yet, as late as the 1100s, Europe is still using this antiquated, clumsy Roman system. What happens to change it? Well, look at the map of Italy. Can you see Pisa in the top left, as in a leaning tower, not as in a slice of? And Pisa, falling behind Genoa and Venice, decides to found a new trading colony in modern Algeria now the town is known as Oran, where Camus grew up and wrote The Plague, but it was originally known as Bujaya. And the senior merchant from Pisa who runs the trading colony in Bujaya brings his kid. The kid goes to school in Bujaya, learns Arabic mathematics as a matter of course, as everyone does at school, goes back to Pisa and discovers all his friends are still doing MCX, MVM, XC, CCM. So he writes a book called the Liber Abaci. Here it is. And that kid, luckily for us, is Fibonacci. So Fibonacci brings the Arabic, what he calls the Hindu number system, to the West. Now, luckily for him, he has a brilliant ruler called, luckily for us, rather, otherwise we'd still be using Latin numbers. He has a brilliant ruler, Frederick II Stupor Mundi, lives in Palermo, comes up to Pisa to meet Fibonacci, having heard about this amazing book of science. Imagine Trump going to Detroit to meet the topper in some mathematical contest. And is so excited by what he discovers that he takes him to Castel del Monte, where, crucially, he introduces him to a Scotsman. This is the walk-on part for Scotland in this. The guy, Roddy, take a bow for Scottish relations here. Michael Scott is the court astrologer, and he reads Fibonacci's Liber Abaci, realizes it's a work of genius, but also, being a good pragmatic Scotsman, realizes it's a wee bit theoretical, he says to Fibonacci. You need to be a wee bit more practical. So we need, he says, we need money conversion, weights and measures, usury, interest rates, all the kind of stuff that merchants can use to make this a practical text that's going to be used to people. It's not just a book of mathematical theory. And so, astonishingly, Fibonacci, aged 18, rewrites his book according to Michael Scott's stipulations, and dedicates it to Michael Scott and to Frederick II. And it becomes the viral textbook for maths in Italy during the Renaissance. It's the text that the Medici read in order to found the Medici Bank. It's also the text that Piero della Francesco reads to get and understand the workings of perspective. And Piero, who we remember as the painter of the greatest small painting, according to Kenneth Clark, The Flagellation, was in fact remembered by his contemporaries as a mathematician. He writes 3 mathematical texts, which when he dies are carried to Milan by his friend Friar Luca Pacioli, and the friar shares it with his flatmate, who is a jobbing painter, painting the Last Supper in a convent in Milan. Leonardo da Vinci. So in 5 steps, we get from Leonardo to Piero, Piero to Fibonacci, Fibonacci to Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Khwarizmi to Brahmagupta, Brahmagupta to Aryabhatta. And that's how Indian maths comes to the West. Unfortunately, the next thing is it goes to London and we get the East India Company, but that's a different story for another time. Okay, thank you.
Would you like to call people out, or?
Sure. Gentleman in the very attractive cravat.
I'm interested in the possibility that Jesus learned Buddhism and that the big change in Western theology actually was influenced by Buddhists in Alexandria.
Not impossible. We've no evidence for it.
Any scholar who works on that topic?
So the timing's not quite right, because it's the generation after Jesus who get the benefit of what Augustus. Remember, at the beginning of the Gospel, Augustus is Caesar during the Nativity. He has the census, all that stuff. Augustus conquers Egypt, and it's after Augustus conquers Egypt that you begin to get these Roman trading missions to Egypt. So it's really in the kind of just after the crucifixion, after 30, 40 AD, after the sacking of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. After that is the period.
But St. Thomas was certainly going back and forth.
So exactly. So not impossible. No. And St. Thomas, there's a whole variety of different Christian groups in southern India that believe that St. Thomas left after the Last Supper and traveled down to India. And certainly there are Jewish groups from a very ancient period, as well as Christian groups in Kerala. So absolutely not impossible, but no evidence for it.
Were there Buddhists in the schools at Alexandria?
There's one Buddhist gravestone in Alexandria. Yeah. So this is a future PhD for someone, but it's I've studied this early Christianity in India, and the problem is that the Portuguese burnt all the early Christian texts in India at the Council of Dampierre in the 16th century. So all the evidence is lost. So we can make suppositions, we can guess, we can propose theses, but the evidence so far is absent. One more question. Okay. One more question. A lady. a man.
I find it interesting that both India and China are part of the BRICS alliance. What impact do you think this will have for the future of India and beyond?
Well, I think BRICS has been given an incredible shot in the arm by Trump putting out the Indians in the last month. The first thing that Modi did was go to travel to Beijing. And if you make enemies of potential rivals, they will obviously ally together against a common threat. So it seems to me that it's incredibly damaging to America's interest to alienate India. That's my personal opinion.
Okay, thanks to Professor Dalrymple.